This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. Alright, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 25 of Modern Gaming Culture. Last episode left off with description. Sorry, what I'm going to be talking about when it comes to this dynamic of what I consider the times we living in, right, which is internet dark age, and this sort of character that's emerged, right, which I refer to as like the internet bully, right, um, and left off sort of leaving a description, right, for for consideration, right, sort of contemplate the sort of dynamic, right, because with how widespread and built into the earth practically, to the point where with a lot of this stuff that's been happening, you know completely not the wishes of the powers that should not be, right, and basically their inability to really reel in speed, etc., right? Um, like they used to, right? For I call the internet censorship wave occurred, right? And COVID happened, and after that, um, it's not something where they can, necessarily reel in, right? A lot of that, as effectively as they could anymore, right? And so, you know, it's something where you really cannot, you know, um, cast pearls before swine, right? You mean like because again, right? A lot of you guys, right? Um, you know, you grew up, and you guys had iPhone 12s, right? When you were like 3 years old, right? And so you don't really understand, what it looks like when somebody is really reaching the end of the rope, right? And so, a lot of stuff it doesn't even necessarily even go over your head, right? You can't even encounter it, right? And so, you know, when your parents are talking to you, you need to listen to them, right? They know better, right? And so, you know, um, it's something where, especially when it comes to um, really understanding things like censorship, etc., right? Censorship can take a myriad of forms, right? It's not necessarily just preventing someone from speaking, right? People can, misrepresent things, right? They can just put out blatant misinformation, right? They can just tell blatant lies, right? Make stuff up, right? Do all sorts of stuff, right? To really lead people off the beaten path, so to speak, right? So especially these days, right? Again, with censorship being something that's so egregious of a cosmic crime, let alone you know entering really that judicial arena, right? You know, it's not something that you can necessarily play around, right? Just say again, right? With a lot of people, say, I'm an anarchist, or, I'm an ANCOM, or I'm an ANCAP, or this and that, right? And then even going so far as to really having a, you know, persona, right? Amongst that, right? Um, you know, this is something where you really need to be discerning, right? And really not give credit where credit is due, ultimately, right? You know, we're really reaching a point where, again, I think this is something I've been talking about on the show, right? The type of colossal skill sets you really need to have, right? And know how, the show doesn't represent me just turning on my microphone, right? And my webcam, and just saying what's on my mind, right? And how much time and effort, I put into preparing for the show alone, right? And so, these are things that, you really, really have to dig and really have to, listen to those around you, right? Because, um, again, right, if you think somehow that, because when I was growing up, right, I was able to say, I'm a 90s kid, even though, maybe I wasn't necessarily born in the 90s, right? Because, things didn't change that much between, forget even 19, like, things didn't change that much, right? And so it's something where, yeah, for sure. And especially when you have a really good upbringing, right? You know, I'm not saying that I had a really good upbringing, right? But, you know, um, when you've had a really good upbringing, right? You know, it's not something where you're like, oh my gosh, things used to be so great, right? And now here we are, right? Again, you guys have iPhone 12 when you guys are 3 years old. You guys have no idea what's going on at all. All right. And so, you know, this series is gonna take as long as it takes, right? Um, you know, and I talk about how I want to do, 3, 4 episodes in a row, right? And really sit down, formatting everything, putting it out, right? Um, and really, really, taking apart dynamics that I feel like I need to take apart, etc. Right? Um, because that's how, internet radio was being done, right? People were sitting down and, taking apart dynamics a little bit at a time and meeting out a little bit at a time, right? Maybe 4, 7 episodes a night, right? Um, really getting into that, that internet radio headspace, right? You have that character Max Headroom, right? And so it's like, you know, it's not something where you can really take this lightly, right? When I say that, internet radio, right, was really, completely shut down, right, by the internet censorship wave. It really was, right? And the material, you're never going to find it, right? Because a lot of these people didn't have backups, etc. They didn't set up websites, and they were really relying on these big tech platforms, right, to really host their content, right? And, again, when censorship was being done, right, by people, now it's just AI, right? When censorship was being done by people, right, it wouldn't even matter, right? You have people like Alex Jones, David Icke, right, Lawrence Southern, Stefan Molyneux, and people are trying to tell you again, right? Obviously, right? It's not something where, people like to talk about, you have the coincidence theorist, right? People like to say everything's a coincidence, right? No, they don't, but that's neither here nor there, right? You know, people like to say everything's a coincidence, right? When Alex Jones, you know, Stefan Molyneux, Learn Southern, David Icke were all taken off of every single platform pretty much on the same day, right? That's never gonna happen again. You know, now it's just AI, right? And AI doesn't even know what I'm talking about, right? Because there's no, it's gone. All the material's gone, right? AI. If you really understand anything about AI, right, you know that AI has to pull from somewhere. AI doesn't think. It's not a it's a program on a computer, right? It's computer software. It's machine learning, right? And so it's not something that is complicated like you, right? And so if you say the most egregious, heinous things, AI will never pick up on it because it has nothing to look for because all the material is gone, right? It's just fear that ultimately is controlling, the dissemination of information through the internet now these days, if anything, right? If you really, really, really understand, right, what is driving, you know, sort of the flow of information on the internet, it's fear. Pure and simple. If you really, really, really break it down, it's fear. Plain and simple, right? And you guys are never gonna get it, but you know, that's not the point, right? Point is, I'm talking about the times I consider us to be living in, which is the internet dark age, right? The characters emerge, right? Which I call the internet bully, right? You know, give a description, right? Last episode, right? Um, and really talking about this character, that has really emerged, right? Um, in absence of, literally like, Maoist, Stalinist, Leninist type censorship, right? Um, where, essentially they realize, their number is up, right? And, if they don't act soon, they're gonna be out of a job, right? And forget, you know, paradigm shift, whatever. They're literally gonna be on the street because they just can't take it anymore, right? Let alone, you know, again, right? And so, you know, it's something where, you know, this is something that, is occurring. It's occurring. People are recognizing it, right? And necessarily the issue is really understanding, having your ducks in a row, etc. Right? The sort of underlying, and I realize with a lot of people they generally don't have this issue because generally, it's often been said that money makes the world go round, right? Money is the most powerful religion on earth, right? And so when it really comes to really understanding a lot of these things, right? Generally, a lot of these things can be figured out pretty honestly, again, right? Um, and so it's like people really have to be discerning when it comes to really a lot of these dynamics, right? You can't literally let your wits go to the wayside, as I say, right? And you cannot just um, kind of just let your skills dry up, right? Skill sets are something that really needs to be honed, and so when you're really sort of getting into this rhythm of sort of telling yourself you know how great of a person you are, telling yourself how good of a person you are, etc. Right? You don't know what's out there, right? And so you know um, you can really find yourself pretty shocked and appalled, by really the human condition, right? Um, and you know, um, teach their own, right? But that's not the point, right? We're talking about is sort of times I consider us to be living in, right? You know, this is not a show about current events, right? And so, I'm not gonna come up here and tell you, how the Bengals are doing or something like that, or how whatever, right? How Chiefs are not gonna get to the Super Bowl again or whatever. I know sports you watch, what you sports, whatever, right? But you know, really want to really drill into people's heads, sort of understanding, kind of where people are coming from, right? Again, right? Because above all else, right? People recognize that you can't get sucked in to technology. And so a problem that people generally have these days when it comes to rearing children, etc., is that once children reach that sort of rebellious phase, and I feel like they're reaching it quite early because interact with some of these kids, 7, 8 years old, and they're really, really acting like they know it all. It's really fucked up, to be honest, right? Um, that when your parents start texting you nicely, and again, right, this is things that are just making society just get so worse, right? So much more worse than you can even possibly imagine, right? Because when you start playing these games, you realize these kids are not getting sucked in, right? that's not good at all, right? And so, it's something where people don't even realize how much damage they're doing, and they're not even doing damage, right? They're just stunting their own growth in all aspects, right? And so you can imagine, you have people, in their mid 40s, 50s, right? They can't even, lick an envelope, right? And like ship an item using a postal service, right? So you can imagine how some of these kids are going to be growing up, and I mean, you hear talks of stuff like universal basic income, etc., right? I mean, it's going to be so bad. People aren't even going to be able to, um, even boot a computer, right? And like open a web browser, let alone contemplate the internet, because they're just going to be so like stunted, right? It's not anything else, right? Like again, right? People really like to make fun of people for, their, idiocy, lunacy, whatever, right? Have all these, very egregious terms that they use for people. Yeah, people are really becoming, you know, like dumber than people that actually have actual like, you know, conditions, of, the mind, right? And the psychological makeup, right? And the physiological makeup, right? Right. And, they are actually becoming dumber, and so you can imagine with the tiny population that actually occupies on planet Earth, right? And then you actually have a very, very large, undetectable population of people who actually are like dumber than them. You can imagine what's coming, right? And it ain't gonna be anything that you could possibly imagine, right? And so that's really what you have to really, really, guard yourself, right? Because again, right, when you understand how grounded people are getting into the real world, right, and it's not something, that is necessarily, good for the world, right? So I think I'm just gonna leave it there for the former part of this episode. I think I'm just gonna close this episode. So it's been Modern Game Culture. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you.